How's it going tonight? I am going to do a little talk about Ted Bundy and Ann Rule. They had worked together, and Ann Rule had no idea that she was working with a serial killer. At first, she really didn't believe that he was capable of all these crimes, but as time goes by, and as I further explain their relationship, she came to know that it was true. Just a word about what my purpose here is. It's for information purposes, and we'll just take a few minutes to think about, I'm not here to glorify the monster that committed these crimes, but I am here to talk a little bit about the victims and just take a few moments to have some respect for the victims and their families. And if you think about it, even Ted Bundy's family were victims as well, especially his poor mother, who just was astonished and could not believe that her son had done these horrible things. So we are going to go ahead and get started. All right, let's talk a little bit about who Ann Rule was. She was born Ann Ray Steckhouse on October 22nd, 1931 in Lowell, Michigan in the U.S. She died July 26, 2015. She was aged 83 in Buren, Washington State. Her occupation was a writer. She wrote mostly true crime. Her notable works were The Stranger Beside Me, 1980, and that's about Ted Bundy, whom she worked with and considered a friend. Small Sacrifices in 1987, about Oregon child murderer Diane Downs. Her education, she graduated from Coatesville High School in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and later earned an associate's degree from Highland Community College in Des Moines, Washington. Rule also attended the University of Washington, studying creative writing, criminology, and psychology, which really set up her as one of the first writers that really wrote in the true crime genre to where it became a popularized genre to write in. She really had the background for that, as a lot of her family worked in police force, and she also did for a time. Also, Ann Rule, her career included working in law enforcement as an officer for Seattle Police Department, as well as writing for publications, they say geared towards women. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by that. In 1969, she wrote for True Detective magazine, and she had a pen name, Andy Stack. And here's a cover of one of the articles that she had written about the Boston Strangler, where it says, "Death for the Pretty Cheerleader Strangler." That was her article, but she was writing under the name Andy Stack. In 1971, she volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline center where she met Ted Bundy. He was a work-study student who was studying psychology at the University of Washington. And during the time they worked together, Rule observed nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality and saw him as a kind person, very empathetic. He would even walk her out to her car at the end of her shift and say, "Now, Ann, I don't want anything to happen to you. So be safe on your way home." She'd often said that if she were 10 years younger or her girls were a little older, that he might be a good guy to go out with, and that remained to be seen. So in 1980, The Stranger Beside Me, it was considered one of the most definitive biographies of Bundy. She did have the insider knowledge. She was friends with him for 10 years. It was first published in 1980 when Bundy was convicted for murder. The book was written under her own name rather than her pen name. So once that book became popular, they published her next 3 books under her own name, which would be The Lust Killer, and that's about Jerry Burdos, The One-Ad Killer about Harvey Cardigan, and The I-5 Killer about Randall Woodfield. First, they were released in her pen name, but later, once the Bundy book came out, they started releasing them in her own name. Her themes, what she was looking for, and I think mainly this is with her experience with Bundy and thereafter, she was looking for an anti-hero whose eventually arrest shocks, and they shock the people that knew him or her. They would be attractive, brilliant, charming, popular, wealthy, talented, and much admired in their communities, but really hiding behind masks. And she really kind of got that from Bundy first because, you know, people felt that he was attractive and charming in a very superficial way. And she was definitely surprised to find out what he was really like. But she feels that people want to know about the kind of person whom you would not imagine having a monstrous self behind the pleasant face. But the critics of The Stranger Beside Me accused Rule of making a poor ethical choice because she could get an inside story on Bundy being her friend. That remains to be seen. I mean, they were friends, and it was actually Bundy that kind of approached her when he was in jail to write a book, which she really didn't know what he was driving at the time or what he wanted her to do. But we'll get more into how Ann Rule's writing took her to and through the Bundy story. Now, a little bit about Ted Bundy. He was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24th in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. He died January 24th, 1989 at the age of 42 in a Florida state prison. Spoiler alert, he was executed by electrocution. He used aliases. He would often change his appearance, sometimes wearing a fake mustache, sometimes growing his hair out, sometimes cutting it short, always very well dressed. Sometimes he would put on like a British accent or put on his charm to try to get these women to go with him or to put one over on people. He had a very controlled image that he would present with certain people under certain circumstances, very controlled how people perceived him. And he would change his appearance, mainly to avoid detection when he was doing his crimes. So his education, originally he got a scholarship to the University of Puget Sound, where for some reason he thought it was important to take Chinese because he thought that the world commodity markets would be opening up in China. But later on he did attend the University of Washington where he was a psychology student, and then Temple University in Utah where he got a law degree. He did get married in 1980 to 86, and his spouse is Carol Ann Boone, and he has one child. And we'll get to that little detail in a little while. So if you see on the left there, I got a really nice wanted poster because he was wanted by the FBI. When he was in jail and was sentenced to death, he did do some confessions. What he confessed to who and whom and what image he was trying to portray depends on the circumstance. There are recorded confessions, and then of course Netflix has just come out with some more of the tapes that weren't necessarily heard. He admitted to 30 murders, victims. His crime spree ran from February 1st, 1974 to February 9th, 1978. He lived in California, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. He was convicted of burglary, aggravated kidnapping, attempted murder, and murder. And then, of course, he was executed. A thing about Bundy, though, his criminal sophistication was that he knew that the police at that time in the 70s were not very good at communicating with each other, and he would travel often, sometimes 500 miles here and there with the victim to a disposal site just to stay out of jurisdictions, or so then one jurisdiction to realize that he was committing these crimes, one or the other, in different areas. Okay, so his early life. So Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24th, and he was born to Eleanor Louise Cowell. and she was known as Louise, and it was at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His father's identity is not known, but back when he was born, they stamped his birth certificate with illegitimate, saying that he was born out of wedlock, which is an arcane way to fill out a birth certificate. And back when he was born, it was quite the stigma for being an unwed mother and to be the child of an unwed mother. And for the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in Philadelphia, home of his maternal grandparents, and that would be Sam and Eleanor. They raised him as their son to avoid the stigma of being born outside of wedlock. So there was some thoughts that maybe his grandfather was really his father, but there's no proof of that. There is some speculation. When he did find out the truth, it upset him immensely. He didn't like having that stigma or the idea of, but depending on who he was talking to, he would tell a different story about how he found out that, he was illegitimate, or, one story says his cousin showed him the birth certificate. Another one said that he went back up to Philadelphia to find it. So once he found that out, he was kind of angered. He felt everybody was lying to him because they were pretending his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. And it's thought that this might have led to some of his pathology. So in his early life, Bundy occasionally exhibited some disturbing behavior. In early age, his Aunt Julia, after waking up from a nap, found him. He was 3 years old, and the story goes that she woke up from a nap and he had laid out all the kitchen knives around her, which is very disturbing. I don't think I'd like that very much if my nephew did that to me. So in 1950, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and a lot of her family members asked her to move out west with her uncle and some of her cousins. So she changed her identity. She moved out of the area because, the rumors were flying about unwed mother and all these things. So she decided to start a new life. And in 1951, she met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, and they married. And later, Johnny Bundy adopted Ted, and that gave Ted the last name of Bundy. He had 4 children, 4 siblings as well. And Johnny tried to include Ted into like camping and Cub Scouts, but he always kind of stayed away and remained a stranger and didn't really like his stepdad very well. And he later complained to his girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father, and he wasn't very bright, and he didn't make much money, because Bundy felt self-worth had to do with appearances and money. So while he was in Tacoma, there were different recollections or stories that he told the biographers. There was Mashud and Ainsworth. They were journalists, and they recorded a lot of interviews with him. So he said he used to roam his neighborhood and he'd pick through the trash barrels and he's looking for pictures of naked women. But when he spoke to one of his defense attorneys, he said how he would peruse those detective magazines, crime novels, true crime documentaries, and he was looking for stories of sexual violence, and particularly when the stories were illustrated or had pictures of dead or maimed bodies, he was really into that. But then, of course, he told Ann Rule, oh, no, I never, in fact, read those detective magazines. I don't know why anybody would ever do that. And then later on, another conversation he had with Michonne, he described how he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he would observe women undressing. So he was a peeping Tom, pretty creepy behavior going on there. And that's as a teen. He also had varying accounts of his social life, especially in high school. He said he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He also claimed he had no natural sense of how to develop friendships, and he didn't know what made people want to be friends. He just didn't understand how social interactions work, and then that goes to a little bit of, being a sociopath. You don't understand social cues, didn't quite get it. But of course, his classmates had a different story, and they thought he was well known and well liked. He was kind of a medium-sized fish in a large pond. He did like downhill skiing. Bundy really enjoyed downhill skiing, and that's where his interest was shared by his girlfriend, but that comes up later. But he would steal equipment. He forged lift tickets. In high school, he was arrested for burglary, auto theft, but of course those things were expunged when he turned 18. He was suspected of shoplifting, breaking into houses, stealing things. They didn't catch him for being a peeping Tom at that time, though. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Bundy's university years. So after graduating from high school in 1965, Bundy went to Puget Sound for a year, and then he transferred to the University of Washington. And that is where he became romantically involved with Stephanie Brooks. And that's the pseudonym they use in many biographies. A lot of times they didn't give the real names, and when they did give the real name of one of his girlfriends, then she was hounded by the press, and then they kind of felt badly about it later. And I think some of the women that he was involved with actually have changed their names since. So the relationship he had with Diane had a lasting impact on Bundy. So this was like his first intimate relationship. So her real name is Diane Edwards. They call her Stephanie Brooks in some of the books. She was only in his life a couple years, but in the Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, the relationship had a lasting impact. They believe that this breakup of the relationship formed his pathology and influenced the type of women that he hunted, and the rage he felt towards Diane would be what he inflicted on his victims. So that's part of his pathology, and it has to do with the breakup of his first relationship, intimate relationship. And so Anne, of course, knew him over a 10-year span, and she suspects Diane was the first woman he was intimate with and had very strong feelings for her, but of course, she didn't have as strong feelings for him. She kind of felt like it was a summer romance and, like a college romance. Eventually, he didn't seem like he was going anywhere, and she thought she would break it off with him. But what he saw was a woman that was the woman of his dreams, that she was the most beautiful woman in the world. She was sophisticated. Okay, so I didn't plan the sirens in the background. So yeah, added for effect. Diane Edwards, she started to detect some small signs that her boyfriend wasn't a good person. She had a nagging suspicion that he used people and that he would become close to people who could do a favor for him or get him something he wanted, like he took advantage of them. People sometimes take it hard when they break up. So with Bundy's case, what you're doing is you're taking on and processing in a very unhealthy way the run-of-the-mill emotional angst with the psychotic tendencies of a serial killer. Well, for Ted, he obsessed over this one relationship, and it was ending. And he allowed it to have a lasting effect, and he responded to it with some pretty spiteful actions. So the first thing he set out to do, he believed that it was his lack of money that was a contributing factor, because of course Diane Edwards was a cut above. She was high society. She had a wealthy family, and pretty much Bundy came from working class roots. He felt that that could be the reason why at the point where they started to break up, they were a long distance relationship, and then Edwards graduated and she went to San Francisco for a job. And then Bundy admitted to, after the breakup, he had an overwhelming feeling of rejection. He started to think he needed to really get even with Diane. And as Anne wrote, by God, if it took whatever he had, he was going to change. Anne Rule wrote in her book detailing how Bundy handled the big breakup. By sheer force of will, he would become the kind of man that the world, and particularly Edward, saw as a success. So first off, he became adamant about attaining more status. And he says, she inspired me to look at myself and become something more, according to those Bundy tapes. And after the breakup, he threw himself into his studies. He actually met another woman named Elizabeth Kloepfer, who became a long-term girlfriend, who didn't know about Edwards at the time, and it's pretty complicated. I don't know how somebody who has few social skills can manage that, but obviously he did. So in 1970, he was even hailed as a hero because he saved a 3-year-old from drowning. So the police thought he was a great guy. Also, he became active in politics. So an interesting thing was that Bundy was a conservative, a Republican, and he was all in for Nixon. And he opposed the Vietnam War, and he called the people that opposed the war delinquents. And he started to work for the Republican Party. He even helped to get the governor of Washington reelected. Bundy found politics appealing because it was all about image, and that is what Bundy learned to do, is control his image depending on who he was with and what he wanted angle to play. In 1972, while he was working at the Crisis Center with Ann Rule, he confessed to her that he was still in love with Edwards despite the breakup, and so he's trying to talk to Anne and says, do you think she would still love me if I sent her a dozen roses? And he described her as the only woman he ever loved. So let's get into some revenge here. So in 1973, Bundy spent a few days with Edwards and even appeared to reignite their relationship, but it wasn't sincere. It was ultimately a maneuver to hurt her. And by late summer of 1973, Ted had begun to be somebody. He had worked, planned, and groomed himself to be the kind of man that he thought Edwards wanted. And he visited California on a business trip, and he contacted Edwards, and they met up, and she was so amazed by the changes that the 4 years had brought. And they went out to dinner, and soon they were an item, and Edward was very impressed, and he started calling her his fiance. And so whether they were going to plan to marry or not was up in the air at that time. But Edwards was convinced that they were going to get married by the end of the year. But after the holidays of 1973, Edwards flew to Seattle again, and Bundy became cold and evasive over their plans to marry. For example, he showed her a fancy chess set he had bought for one of his friends in the Republican Party, but he neglected to buy her anything for Christmas that year. And with no explanation for the change of heart, Edwards was getting upset, obviously, and she wrote Bundy a letter, and he didn't write back. Now, Bundy wrote a lot of letters. Even when he was in jail, he would write like legal pads full of letters to people like Ann Rule and some of his friends. He would write and write and write, but he's not writing back to her. So finally she'd had enough of it, and she called to yell at him like, what is going on? And he pretty much says, I have no idea what you mean. And then he hung up. Click. So it just seemed like an elaborate plan to build her back up, make her want to get married to him, fall in love with him again, and then break it off because, you know, she hurt him, so he got his revenge. So that is what Edwards concluded from this whole courtship thing he was going through, that he would be in control. He would be in control of the situation, and he would be the one to break up with her. So he would have the power in that situation. So let's talk a little bit about the other girlfriend he had at the time. This is Liz Kendall. In the Amazon docuseries, Ted Bundy Falling for a Killer, Elizabeth Kloepfer, which they, of course, again with the alias, she explained that this story has been told many times by men. And she says, at the beginning of the series of the trailer, now it's time to talk about our own story from beginning to end, because we lived and so many didn't. So in 1969, Liz ended her marriage and moved to Seattle with her daughter, Mollie, to start a new life. And on her first night out in her new city, she met Ted at the Sandpiper Tavern, and things moved pretty fast. And she says that she became dependent, and I believe it's emotionally, on Ted. And at one point in their 7-year relationship, she even thought she might marry him. And they had gone as far as getting a marriage license. She had worked at the University of Washington School of Medicine, where she was a secretary when she met Bundy, and that kind of comes into play later on. So in February 1970, a mere 4 months after their first dance, the couple got a marriage license, and they went to the courthouse, but somehow they got into a big fight, and Ted decided to tear it all up, and so they decided they'd work on their relationship. So in 74, Liz started to grow suspicious of Ted Bundy's behavior, and she even contacted the police because the police were looking for a serial killer at the time, which we'll get more into his crimes later and what started her suspicions. But she started to find some things with Ted that she didn't understand. They had a rocky relationship. And while he was serving time in jail in Florida, Bundy called her and he admitted that he once tried to murder her. He said that he had tampered with the fireplace and put a towel in the crack of the door so that the smoke would stay in the house. In hindsight, Kloepfer wrote that she remembered that night and had opened a window for some fresh air when she was having trouble breathing. And she's just revised part of this book last year in 2019. She wrote the book, The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy. And it was detailing their turbulent 6-year relationship. And he was really leading the double life of trying to be a loving partner, but he would get into these moods, and he was also killing people. So that's not really good. So Kloepfer, she describes herself in the book as shy, insecure, a lonely single mom. She was divorced. She was struggling with alcoholism. She was looking for somebody to love her. She wanted to be married. She wanted to find a father for her young daughter. And pretty much she handed her life, and again, I think her emotional life, to Ted and says, here, take care of me. And he did in a lot of ways, but he was also, again, moody. He could be very cold. When he was in love with her and treating her nicely, she was very happy. When he was cold and his feelings were inconsistent, she has wondered what she did wrong. And again, this is part of his manipulation. He did use her as kind of a cover story and kind of an alibi at one time. And he also used her for money because she was helping him pay for his law school. his feelings could be strong but inconsistent, which really kind of, she didn't know where she stood with him sometimes. So it started to get strange in 74 after there were some news reports that surfaced about some rapes and murders of 2 women in the area. And the name Ted was being mentioned by witnesses, as well as a Volkswagen, which of course Ted drove the Volkswagen. So she became suspicious, but she really didn't want to believe that he was capable. So she started to question him about some strange behaviors, and then some things she had found in the apartment, like a meat cleaver on his desk, a surgical glove in his coat pocket, or why he drove hundreds of miles to Colorado one night to de-stress from work. So he used his intelligence and charm to talk his way out of it, and always coming up with an excuse or a reason why he had these things and why he was behaving strangely. So he always had an excuse for it. And, you know, he could charm her into thinking that he was telling her the truth, or that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation of why he behaved a certain way, or why he had a brand new stereo in his apartment that she suspected that he had stolen. And she actually asked him if he did, and then he was very verbally abusive to her at that point when she had accused him. So pretty much said, it's none of your business. So their relationship over time began to fizzle when Ted moved to Olympia for a job, and then to Utah, and they saw each other less and less and started dating other people. But they always stayed in touch. And again, he wrote giant letters to people on legal pads and called them from jail. And then she thought they were in love again because he'd write all these nice flowery words to her. But she did have her suspicions. So there were some news reports from some women in the new places where he lived were missing. In the new places he lived, she started to become even more suspicious again in 1975. So she started to talk to the police, like behind the scenes, and started to give them some information, which was able to help charge him later of murders. So Kloepfer wrote that she had struggled to come to terms with the man she loved, being the same man who committed all of these terrible crimes and murders. And since they're split, she battled alcoholism, struggled to be close to people, and relied on her faith to guide her through the dark times. So now her spiritual growth is extremely important to her. And she was praying for Ted, but was also sickened by him and what he did. She believed it was a tragedy that this warm and loving man is driven to kill. So let's talk a little bit about some of the women that were murdered from a span of January to July in 1974. It's important to know that forensics was a little different back then. In order to do anything with fingerprints, they had to look at them each page to try to make a match. They really didn't have DNA. A lot of police jurisdictions did not communicate with each other, and I believe that Bundy knew how these things worked, and plus changing his appearance and committing crimes in different areas. So then, you know, they would just think it was a separate incident in each locality, that they wouldn't talk to each other and the investigations wouldn't go any further. So I think he really took advantage of that. He also took advantage of these young ladies being helpful and wanting to help or be friendly. And really, if sociopaths came with horns on their head, you would know to avoid them, but he looked like an ordinary person. He didn't look like a monster, and he would put on the charm. So Bundy started to kill these 8 women in Seattle and Oregon. So it would be Linda Ann Healy and Donna Gail Manson, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Brenda Carol Ball, Georgianne Hawkins, and Roberta Kathleen Parks. Now, if you look at all these pictures, you might notice that they all have brown hair parted in the middle. Now, given that that was a popular hairstyle at the time, but it also looks like Diane Edwards. So the pathology, or the thought on his pathology, is that he is continually enacting his revenge on her by committing these heinous crimes. But the rage is really directed at her, according to people that have studied Bundy. Now, this is a key event, the Lake Sammamish, on July 14th, 1974. There was a big crowd gathered there. The weather was very nice. It's a national park, a lot of people out and about. And that's where Bundy ran into and killed Janice Ott and Denise Naslin. And there were several witnesses at the time that had overheard this. There were also other women that had gone to his car, and some of them were like, you don't have a boat? So they laughed, because his thing was, can you help me move my sailboat off my car? Which doesn't make much sense if you think that you're gonna get a young woman to help you. Why wouldn't you get a guy to do it? But that was part of his ruse. So he had his fake arm in a sling, and he approached Janice, and around noon, and she was sitting on a blanket near the beach. And after a brief chat, he convinced Ott to go and help him move a sailboat off his car. And people nearby remember hearing him say his name was Ted. So she says, my name is Jan, hi. And he's like, hi, my name is Ted. So why he used his real name, who knows? But at the time, the police, when they were investigating this, thought there's no way this guy's using his real name. But there you go. And then later that same day, he did kidnap and kill Denise Naslin. So that's really brazen. But some mistakes that he had made was using his real name, getting bold enough to attempt 2 crimes. He also was trying to kidnap some other girls, and the one that went to his car knew that he drove the VW, and there were other witnesses that saw Ott walking towards the VW with him to the parking lot. So that's how they knew what kind of car he drove. So what they had come up with was this composite sketch. Now, I rarely think that these composites look much like the person, but if you look down at the bottom there and the 2 in black and white, you can kind of see, hey, that kind of looks right. And then when you see that middle picture, there's 2 arrows pointing to Volkswagen. That might have been his, might not have, because what had happened after the incidents and the women had gone missing, the police asked for help of any photographs or anything that people that were at that park that day would turn in, and that's one of the pictures. So he appeared at Lake Sammamish Park, and it's near Seattle, Washington. He was wearing the cast. It said his name was Ted. He needed help moving his boat onto his car, and the first young lady declined, and later saw Bundy approach another woman who then disappeared. And the women that encountered Bundy told police that he said his name was Ted, and other witnesses overheard Bundy introduce himself as Ted. And police, of course, released this sketch, which also appeared in the newspapers, with the Ted suspect, and that he had driven either a gold or a white Volkswagen Bug. So in the fall of 1974, Bundy went to law school, and then that is where young ladies started to get murdered and disappeared again. This is now in Utah, where he's going to law school. So Nancy Wilcox, who was only 16, she disappeared. She was last seen riding in a Volkswagen Bug. She was hitchhiking at the time, and back in the 70s, A lot of young people, both male and female, would hitchhike as a mode of transportation. Probably because of Bundy, they stopped being a mode of transportation of choice between people who didn't have vehicles or means to get anywhere. Her body was never recovered. And then on the 18th, Melissa Smith disappeared in a pizza parlor parking lot. She was supposed to stay the night at a friend's, but she went to the pizza place to talk to one of her other friends. And then she was last seen in that parking lot, but she never showed up to the slumber party. And she was not the kind of girl that would run away. So then on October 31st, he got Laura Amy, and she was last seen leaving a cafe near Lehi, Utah. And they found her remains in Wasatch Mountains. Back then, they would identify by dental records. They didn't have DNA and nearly the sophisticated like hair and fiber and things that police investigations use now. He also got Deborah Kent. She was supposed to go pick her brother up at the skating rink, and they did find a handcuff key in the parking lot of the skating rink, which is kind of a clue to something that happens a little later on. And this is it. On November 8th, 1974, Carol Durant, she actually escapes Bundy. Now, Bundy at the time, he was dressed in a suit jacket, a fake mustache, was pretending to be a police officer. He saw Durant at a Wellman's Books at the mall. He identified himself as Officer Roslyn, told her that someone was trying to break into her car and that she would have to come to the station and file a report. She asked him for some ID, and he quickly flashed a badge. She's 18. He seems like an authority figure. Somehow he charmed or seemed professional or whatever it was. He coerced her to get into his car and to go to the station with him, but she could smell some alcohol on his breath and started to think that things were very strange. Told her to put on a seatbelt, and she said no. She was about ready to jump out of the car. She asked him why he was driving in the wrong direction to the police station, and that's when he took off at a high rate of speed. Then he slams on the brakes, and he tried to handcuff her. Now they found the handcuff key, remember previously at the skating rink parking lot. He tried to handcuff her, but he accidentally put both cuffs on her same wrist. And then he held a small gun on her. And then she pretty much threw herself out of the car, rolls out of the car, comes around with a crowbar, and he threw up against the car, and she fought him off, and she broke free, and she flagged down a car, jumped into their back seat, and then Bundy takes off, and then the couple that she got into their car takes her to the police station. And then there's some more Utah murders. So Sue Curtis, bottom right, she was last seen in Layton, Utah. Her remains have never been found. Nancy Baird was seen in Layton, Utah at a gas station where she worked, and her remains were not found. And then Debbie Smith disappeared, and her remains were found April 1st in 1976 at the Salt Lake International Airport. There's no information or picture for her, but the police behind the scenes were calling it the Girl of the Month Club, which is, sometimes police officers and people in those kind of professions kind of have a macabre sense of humor, but it's more of a coping mechanism. Okay, so in August 1975, Bundy gets arrested for a routine traffic stop. So there's a local highway patrol officer, and he spotted Bundy in his little VW in front of a home where he knew that the parents were out of town. And he tried to approach the car, but Bundy drove off, and the officer caught up with him. Eventually, Bundy pulled over, and he was arrested for attempting to evade an officer. And when they looked in the car, they found this satchel, this bag, and it had assortment of strange items in it that they thought were burglary tools. So they arrested him for having possession of burglary tools, but really it's a ski mask, a rope, an ice pick, handcuffs, and crowbar, and flashlight, and some other things that they found. So what was even more interesting to the police was that the man that they pulled over for evading the officer matched a description of the ranch's would-be kidnapper. So the police called the ranch down to the station to pick Bundy out of a lineup. And she did, despite him looking drastically different. Now, if you see the Ted suspect where his hair is all grown out and he's got like sideburns and whatever, here his hair is all cut short and he's not wearing his little tennis outfit. He's looking completely different, but she still was able to pick him out of the crowd. So in 1976, Bundy was found guilty of kidnapping and he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison, but he was extradited to Colorado to be tried for murder. So he, of course, did some killing in Colorado. So in 75, he went from his home base in Utah to Colorado, and on January 12th, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator of her room. Later, her nude body was found on a dirt road, and she had been killed by blunt trauma to the head and had some very distinctive linear groove depressions in her skull, which they believe was a crowbar markings, and also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon. So by varying his methods of murder, it would also throw police off because usually there's a pattern and a methodology, and people that kill usually kill in the same manner, but he was also doing that to throw the investigations off, besides just going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So on March 15th, 1975, Bundy abducted and killed the ski instructor Julie Cunningham from Vail, Colorado. He killed Denise Lynn Ulverson, Grand Junction, Colorado. In 75, he also kidnapped and drowned Lynette Dawn Culver in a bathtub, and then he said that he disposed her body in Snake River, but none of their remains have been found, and that's more from his confessions when he was on death row. So in Colorado, when he was being extradited, he escaped from jail. So Bundy was charged with Carol Campbell's murder. At the time when he was arrested, he called Ann Boone and asked her if she could ask her police friends why they were looking into his law school records. So she talked to one of her police officer friends, and he said it was just part of a routine investigation. And then Bundy says, oh, well, if anything happens, you might be seeing my name in the paper, and that's about all he said, but that was in reference to this. So he was moved to Aspen, Colorado for the charges. He liked to act in his own defense. He liked to play lawyer. He went to law school, but not regularly, but he thought he would be the best person to defend himself. And I don't know if there's a saying about having a fool for a client, but anyway. So what he did do is he was able to charm the judge and the officers at the jail that since he was acting in his own defense, he'd have access to law library. So they would leave him without shackles, and it happened to be on the second story. The law library happened to be on the second story of the building. And one day he decided he was just gonna jump out the window, and he took off. He went into the mountains, but he didn't really know his way around, so he kind of came back in, and they caught him that time. He was probably missing about a week. And guess what? He escapes again. So his second escape attempt, he somehow got a hold of something in order to cut through the light fixture in his cell, and he ended up climbing up through the air ducts. There it was like a mom and pop jail, so he climbed into actually the jail keeper's apartments, stole a set of clothes, and then he left for good. In January 1978, he flew to Chicago, and then he took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then he was driving a stolen car to Atlanta, and he finally made it to Tallahassee, Florida, by bus. And he signed a rental agreement at a building called the Oaks. January 15, 1978, 3 a.m., Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house in Florida, and there he killed Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. They were beaten and strangled. After attacking Lisa Levy, Bundy entered an adjoining bedroom where he attacked Kathy Kleiner, and he broke her jaw and deeply lacerated her shoulder. And he also attacked Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, a broken jaw, loss of teeth, and a crunched finger. Chandler and Kleiner, they survived the attack, and Kleiner later attributed their survival to a car. The car's headlights were showing through their apartment, and it frightened the attacker. So there was a witness to these attacks at the sorority. It was Nita Neary, and she arrived around 3 a.m. It was nearly dark inside the house, and she heard somebody coming down the stairs and some banging around upstairs. So she didn't know who was coming. She thought maybe it was a burglar or somebody had gotten in the house. She wasn't sure. So she hid around a corner, and she saw a dark figure walking down the stairs. And the person had a block of wood. Some say it was a tree branch in one hand, and he reached for the doorknob, and he hesitated, and she got a look at him. And then later she could see his right profile, and that he had a protruding nose, a long nose, and he was wearing light pants, a dark jacket, and a ski cap. But Bundy was not quite finished. So shortly after the Chi Omega attacks, Bundy traveled several blocks down the road, and he broke onto the apartment of Cheryl Thomas. Her housemates could hear the banging on the other side of the wall. They tried to call her. She didn't answer, so then they called the police. She did survive and testify against him. And the last victim was Kimberly Leach. Now, what Bundy had done was he had stolen a van off of the Florida State campus, and he put some different license plates on this van to a different car. And that's how they identified this van when they found it later on, that it was actually belonged to the Florida University's campus. So that was interesting. And inside the van, they found some forensic evidence from Kimberly Leach's murder. So she was one of the youngest victims. About 2 months after she went missing, her body was found. She had been assaulted and murdered, and then placed in a shed in a wooded area behind the Swanee River State Park. And what they found in the van, which was off the road there, was fibers that matched the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. They found hair and the blood type that was Kimberly in that van, and also on Bundy's clothes. So in 1980, he went to trial in Orlando for kidnapping and murder. And the evidence against Bundy in the Kimberly Leach case ranged from eyewitness testimony that showed that he was pulling her into the van at her middle school. There were people seeing, and the one witness just thought it was just like an angry dad thinking that they had to drag their kid home for some reason. Didn't think anything of it until later. Also, Bundy used a lot of credit cards, and he used a gas credit card that was in his own name, and he did get gas and hotel receipts from Lake City area. While Bundy was doing these murders, he was also stealing credit cards and using people's credit cards. So he was also stealing in that way too, while that's how he was surviving. What would happen is he would say that if a woman had their purse open in the store or something, he would just snatch the wallet out of it. So at the trial, there was some crucial testimony that came from the Chi Omega sorority sisters, and also Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the sorority house on the evening, and then Nita Neary, who saw him leaving. There was physical evidence. He had bitten one of the victims, Lisa Levy's left buttock, and so the forensic dentist they were able to attain a search warrant for his teeth, and they made a mold from it. And so they were able to match his bite marks to the bite marks on the body. And at that time, Ann Boone was in the courtroom up in where the audience sits. And at that point, she realized that there was actual physical evidence to tie Ted Bundy to the case. And when they went into recess, I guess Ted Bundy looked up at her and kind of shrugged her shoulders. And that's when she knew for sure that he had committed these murders. And she went into the bathroom and threw up, which I think would be the proper reaction. So they deliberated less than 7 hours, and they convicted him of the Bowman and Levy murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and that was Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. And the trial judge imposed the death sentences for those murders. And then after that, 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach, and Bundy was found guilty once again. And after less than 8 hours deliberation, the eyewitness testimonies, the material evidence, including clothing fibers, and the jacket had an unusual manufacturing error, and they were able to match that to Bundy's jacket, and also they were on the body. This Carol Ann Boone, so Bundy met her when he was working in Olympia, Washington, but he was also dating Liz Kloepfer at the time. He's a very busy person. So during the penalty phase, Bundy takes advantage of a strange law in Florida that says that a marriage can be legally declared if you declare it in court, in open court. And so he was questioning Carol Ann Boone as a character witness who was also his co-worker, but she had moved to be with him, and he asked her to marry him, and she accepted, and so they were legally married. But he had met her in 1974 when they were working in the Department of Energy Services in Olympia, Washington. And Boone was going through a second divorce and taking care of her son, James, at the time. Now, Boone is another one that was taken in also by Bundy and believed in his innocence the whole time up to a point. So they were also in separate relationships when they met, because, of course, he was with Liz Kloepfer, and she didn't want to date him to begin with, but eventually he wore her down and they started to go out. She thought he was innocent, no doubt in her mind. And she was there every day at court to support him. She was a character witness. So Bundy's move was to appeal to the jury to do this strange marriage proposal. I don't think it impressed anybody, did not impress the jury at all. So I was like, see, I'm a good guy. No. So anyway, she would visit him regularly, and somehow they conceived their child, Rose Bundy, who was born in 1982. It wasn't until 1986, just 3 weeks before Bundy's execution, that Carol Boone decided to divorce and move back to Washington. When Bundy got closer to execution day, he started to confess on tape his crimes, and he confessed to raping and killing and dismembering over 30 women. And at that point, Boone's like, oh. So he ended up confessing in 1980 while he was on death row. He was trying to manipulate even then the idea that he would get more time before he was executed if he would, they called it, try to share bones for bodies, or share bones for more time. He was trying to manipulate then if he felt he gave more and more information that they might keep him alive longer, but eventually the authorities were like, no. But anyway, he did start confessing in a long appeals process, did a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. He's mostly speaking in the third person, which is kind of strange. So he thought because of the stigma confession, but he would, the tapes are really creepy. You can hear some of those on YouTube as well in his own voice, and it's just something that if you're brave or you want to have the hair on the back of your neck stand on end, that if you're interested. Also, you can watch these docu-series as well. So he recounted his crimes. He did shoplift everything of substance that he owned. Liz Kloepfer had seen in his apartment a brand new stereo. This is where'd you get it? His whole thing was he possessed it. He possessed the things that were stolen. He possessed the women. He possessed their last breath. So it was all about a possession thing. So his ultimate one would be taking the human life, and then the physical possession of the remains. So that was part of his pathology. Also, crime profiling was just getting its really big start back in the 70s, early 80s. And so he also interviewed with the special agent, William Hagemeyer, and he's the behavioral analyst unit officer. So he interviewed Bundy. Bundy was kind of hedging his bets with him as well, hoping to buy more time or even them to take back the death sentence. It depends on who he was talking to, what he would admit to, and how he would do it. He would try to manipulate whatever audience was hearing him speak. So again, with the possession thing, back when he was, quote unquote, he thought of himself as an amateur or impulsive killer in the early years. He started to move to what he called his predator phase. So then he starts to develop a certain criminal sophistication over time. And that's why he knew to go to different jurisdictions, use different methods, all those things. So during his execution, there was a big circus outside of the prison. As you can see, there's like a lot of people demonstrating, and guy with a frying pan is all fry, Bundy fry, and nice little poem there, t-shirts they made up. So on January 24th, 1989, Bundy died in the Rayford electric chair at 7:16. And there were a lot of people singing and dancing and fireworks in this pasture across from the prison, and they were very happy when they saw the hearse go. And he was cremated, and his ashes were scattered somewhere, probably so then people couldn't be obsessed and find his grave and do whatever people do. These are my sources that I cited. Some really interesting things to read besides the books. The court briefing, the Florida Supreme Court, it's kind of interesting. Florida Memory Project's kind of a neat place to go. The confession tapes, the FBI vault, the phantom prints. Like I said, that was just updated 2019. She also did a docu-series. And I hope you got some information from this presentation.